Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Capstone Group's presentation on coronavirus, COVID-19 and you, how to keep calm and carry on. Our presentation this evening will present information about the coronavirus, what is it, and who is impacted. We'll provide you with a background and perspective about understanding the nature of the problem from the academic landscape and education policy, from the healthcare perspective, from the legal as it pertains to telemedicine, and the economy and finance. The second part of our discussion will be around solutions. What can you do to build resilience and to get yourself robust enough to navigate through these troubled waters? We'll talk about therapeutic care and mental health. We'll also discuss some of the myths and provide some FAQs around the coronavirus. My name is Claudette Johnson-Berry. I'm a management consultant with IT management, supporting Fortune 500 clients in the financial services, healthcare, and diversified industries. I am a certified business professional in the continuity and risk management arena with more than 20 years in this space. Through the support of the Capstone Group this evening and our distinguished panel speakers, we will be speaking about COVID-19. This invisible pathogen has put a bright, shining light on the stark disparities that exist across Black and Brown communities in America and around the globe. It has highlighted just how vulnerable we are, especially in the time like this when this pandemic rages on our front steps. We are seeing population paradigm shifts across the economy, in education, healthcare, housing, incarceration, and even how we worship. Almost every facet of life we knew before COVID-19 landed in our space has been transformed. As a people of color, we live on a major socioeconomic fault line. Our life disproportionately exists at the epicenter of this pandemic, and it has become more transparent that in a time like this where things are so uncertain, that a number of factors such as education inequity, employment, financial disparity, food insecurity, and a general lack of access to basic medical and mental health care services are affecting us. This limitation in terms of access to basic necessities such as insurance is one of the reasons why COVID-19 is a threat and is doing so much harm to our Black and Brown communities. All this despite the fact that the blood that courses through our veins is blue and bleeds red when exposed to air. Most concerning in our communities is a tremendous amount of chronic illness and pre-existing comorbidities, both from a medical and a mental health perspective, which places each of us and our loved ones at high risk. On another note, the coronavirus has even changed the definition of who is considered essential personnel. This classification now includes non-traditional laborers such as grocery store clerks, the pharmacy tech, delivery drivers, housekeepers, garbage haulers, truck drivers, and many others who support the supply chain, transporting goods and services from the point of sale to the consumer. While it still refers to traditional frontline workers such as first responders, healthcare practitioners, and IT techs, suddenly everyone is working at home or perhaps attending online classes. This isn't a privilege anymore, reserved only for a select few. It has become the only way to operate across the world and to maintain continuity of services for those that are fortunate enough to be in a position to take advantage of this. Some of the challenges we are experiencing currently are being driven by the emergence of the global economy. For communities of color, this has led to a watershed moment. It has put emphasis on the great digital divide that's become more pronounced. For example, who has access to high-speed internet services? Who has access to 5G services? And some of the controversies surrounding the bandwidth in urban centers. So this evening, what we would like to do is to spend time talking about how our communities are being impacted by the coronavirus. Our discussion tonight will touch on several of the critical concerns impacting our community specifically. While this could take several days to discuss, and we are limited to a few hours, one of the things that we'd like to do is to present to you an overview of what the problems are and speak about some solutions. To cover all this information tonight, we ask if you would kindly focus on putting your questions in the chat as we proceed throughout the discussions, and then we'll open the floor for questions. First, I'd like to clarify, what is the coronavirus? Also known as COVID-19. COVID-19 is the name given by the World Health Organization recently, February 11, 2020, for the disease caused by the novel coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. This disease was first identified in Wuhan, China in late 2019 and has spread worldwide. COVID-19 is actually an acronym which stands for the Coronavirus Disease of 2019. Our distinguished panel members this evening will follow up shortly with conversations around the academic and educational landscape. Dr. Susanna Jones and Dr. Velma Lapointe will host the dialogue around that. We also have healthcare perspectives from Dr. Angela Emmons-Burley, the legal perspective as it pertains to telemedicine. Attorney Lisa Hayes will cover off on what's new in the medical arena around coronavirus. On the economy, we have Dr. William Spriggs, who's the chief economist for the AFL-CIO. On the financial services side, Mr. Gary McPherson will speak to us about the CARES package, which is a stimulus funding available through the government. On the mental health landscape, we have Cassandra Jackson, who's a licensed clinician. And on the therapeutic space, Dr. Terry Peters will talk to us about how to make ourselves more resilient when challenged with the situation we are facing with coronavirus.
First discussion that we're going to have is around the academic and education. That space has been significantly disrupted due to the coronavirus. The classroom has now moved into the home and is creating a lot of appreciation for teachers from what I'm hearing from certain segments of the community. So without further ado, I'd like to hand off the conversation and give the mic to Dr. Soni so that she can share with us challenges that they're seeing in the academic space. And then after Dr. Soni, Dr. Lapointe will speak to us about the view from the student's perspective. So Soni, handing it off to you.
So I will be talking today mostly about the ramifications of this pandemic on higher education. In the landscape of higher education, COVID-19 is an unprecedented event. Even with the 1918 Spanish flu, we didn't have nearly the number of colleges, students, faculty, or staff affected. So this particular pandemic has created problems unforeseen, and in many cases, there is no template or guideline on how to respond to certain situations. So institutions are kind of making it up as they go along. So the pandemic has shed light on weaknesses and inequities within and surrounding higher education and within K-12. And Dr. Lapointe will talk more about the K-12 landscape. I'll be focusing today on the higher ed landscape. So now we see the limits of higher education's capacity to support the most vulnerable and needy students, faculty, and staff, but especially our minority serving institutions that were already severely under-resourced, particularly our 2-year and 4-year HBCUs. So how institutions respond during a crisis can define who they are and who they care about. And it might really catalog how they will be remembered after this pandemic is over. But we need to always keep in mind that institutions that have less are being asked to do a lot with even less. So I'm gonna just talk about some of the basic challenges. I'm gonna skim over them because we don't have a lot of time. But first and foremost is we have a systems challenge where institutions like HBCUs were already strapped for infrastructure and system support are being asked to adapt to a new modality, online modality that they may have not been equipped for or even have the infrastructure to support. So capacity for technology to support administrative processes to operate the university are strained and in some cases have to be installed remotely. Technology readiness, meaning the people who actually have to manage the technology and the processes to operate the university now have to learn within a minute how to adapt to this new online modality, even when they may not have any training or competence in that area. And so how do we accommodate different populations, especially special need populations, which HBCUs historically disproportionately serve? How do we accommodate different types of learners, different types of constituents when we're switching to this modality? And is that being taken in account, and is it being supported? And is there any kind of assessment of these processes and a feedback loop? Are we creating a feedback loop on how this is going and how we can do it better? Again, a lot of this is being made up on the spot. And so we see challenges with educator support, adjunct instructors in particular, who have already been underpaid and had enormous class loads. They may not have extra support they need to actually do what they need to do. They were already disconnected from the university. And then professional development for non-online course instructors, people who had never done an online course before now have to learn how to do that and continue the course. There's the consideration of tenure track expectations and timeline. Are we asking professors to do the same amount of work while they're going through this adjustment phase? And keep in mind, as the administrators and faculty have to, that they also have to take on extra home life responsibilities. So how are they making those adjustments and maintaining this load and their expected load at the same time? And so we have issues with STEM research. How do you conduct STEM research when you don't have access to a laboratory? And that relates to STEM funding, which is a major resource at HBCUs. How do we continue and support STEM funding when you can't get into the lab? And then non-faculty staff, such as food workers, janitorial staff, and administrative assistants, if they're not unionized, how are they being taken care of? How long can we go in supporting their wage and salary before there are questions around budget cuts? And so another area that's really fueling some of the challenges here is admissions and financial aid. These things are operated on like a clock along a calendar, and now they've been severely disrupted. So there's been a delay in admissions decisions in some places, not at Howard, but there may be a delay in the deposits or the way families are able to make deposits when we have massive job layoffs, when you have people out of work. It disrupts their financial ability to do things like pay for a financial deposit for admissions decision. So we also may see a decline in applications because applications cost money. And then how does this change financial aid? The whole tax year has been disrupted. And so how does that affect students who are currently enrolled and families who are considering enrolling in college? Will it defer people who might want to enroll, or will it cause students who are already financially insecure to drop out? And so emergency aid is limited, and students dependent on funding may encounter issues, particularly, and Dr. LaPointe will talk about this, with housing insecurity, food insecurity. How are they getting their mental health needs met? And so there have been a lot of institutions that have been responding humanely in ways that take care of their students, but a lot of institutions are running on panic mode, and they're kind of making it up as they go along. And we have to be careful about, are we taking care of our students? Are we taking care of our staff and faculty? And how can we take care of them and also balance our responsibilities? One other area I want to mention is the potential loss of revenue for institutions of higher education, particularly HBCUs that make extra revenue from sponsoring events and engaging in fundraising activities. How do you do that remotely? Are you built to raise funds remotely? And how do you build that remotely? So there's a potential loss of revenue, revision of budgets, a prioritization that was already on the plate of what matters most and what can we cut. Those conversations will get more contentious as the money gets tighter. We're talking possible furloughs and definite hiring freezes in certain categories. And this can eventually impact staff recruitment and staff retention, as a wave of retirement is predicted for higher education. And you're talking about freezing possible raises and incentive funding, professional development. And so what is the incentive for people to stay? So we're facing an uncertain future, and institutions particularly who are resource strapped like HBCUs will face difficult budgeting decisions. But I think moving forward, we have to think about what is our mission, why are we here, who do we care about, and how do we do this in a way that honors that mission while we make sure that we sustain and survive.
Thank you, Dr. Jones, Soni. So I'm going to talk about views and voices from the ground, speaking specifically about my undergraduate and graduate classes that I teach at Howard, as well as integrating their main concerns with readings that I have done along the way. First of all, there are major challenges. And the way I approach the class, my classes right after spring break, it's like put aside the syllabus and let's just deal with how are you doing? And I just open my class up and I tell you, I took about 4 pages worth of notes, and as I got views on what they were concerned about, what their feelings were, not only did they talk about themselves, but their families, their friends, and some even talked about their clients in their internships or service learning projects. In general, clearly students express fears, anxiety. As a matter of fact, anxiety is one of the #1 mental health challenges on college campuses nationally. Some talked about depression. Some students talked about having pre-existing conditions and how they might be affected. Student with sickle cell who gives herself she uses a take-home dialysis machine every night. She does live at home with her mom. Another, a bit more older student talked about coping with diabetes. In general, I would say, just like me as a professor, it's like we're teaching under trauma. The students are traumatized. I know I am, and many people will talk about, oh, you're working at home. Well, we're working at home under abnormal conditions where we literally see on, depending on how long you have that TV on or how long you're tuned into your phone, it is literally a body count going on internationally and nationally. One student from New York just last week at the near the end of our class said, everybody, please pray. I'm in New York. I live in New York, born and raised here. Please pray for us in New York City. Her voice cracking at times. The other concerns that students talked about was the abruptness of the decision, where they were literally told with no advance warning, either stay at home or go back home. And this created financial burdens for people where they had to scrape up money to get a truck to come get their stuff, get it out fast, put it in storage, or drive back home. The other challenge, and Soni mentioned this, automatically everybody is online. Some professors had to get up to speed with learning online technology. Fortunately for us, or for me and my classes, I had been online doing hybrid courses with the plan where hybrid means part online, part on site. And my plan was at the end of the semester, the last month, we would all come together for student presentations, and all of that's going to be held online. Sony did mention that some homes, wherever they go, they may not have adequate access to Wi-Fi. Most students in my courses, because I'm at the advanced level, junior, seniors, and graduate students, they do have iPads, laptops, and some platforms can be accessed on their phones, and most students, I'd say almost 100%, have cell phones. So some materials can be accessed through the phone. Financial and basic living problems, where even in their own families, they were stressed in many cases before the virus came into being. Let me say this, at Howard, like any university, you've got great diversity with respect to economic background, although at most HBCUs, there's the whole issue of most of them are on Pell Grants and federal financial aid, but there are a significant number of students who would be considered well-to-do and may not, or better off for sure, and may not have some of the same concerns. So they have to integrate this new college life with being back home. And many of you have heard about some of the stresses and strains when students like go back home, especially as they transition from college life to the work life, where even with some of the best majors, they may not be able to get a position right off the bat. So there is some adjustment issues there. The other thing that students mentioned, and it's only grown in the last few weeks, is that there are scam artists who are online trying to sell all kinds of products that are in great demand. Price gouging is going on. I even saw recently where a on-site place for testing, some folk had set up this white tent, they had on garb, they were offering these tests, and you pay right then and there. And people only to be found out later that this was a scam operation. Many local, state and the federal governments are going after these scam artists. I was listening to the Attorney General in New York City, who is also a Howard alum, Letitia James, and there are some class action lawsuits going on among attorney generals across the country. So scamming is definitely going on. What are some solutions? I know for me, and I had just gotten this link from Soshana, where in the local area, District, Virginia, and Maryland, a list of resources where students can get food. Food insecurity is an issue among some students. Howard does have a food bank, although not widely necessarily publicized, because they don't want people who may not be in the greatest need just showing up and taking the bounty. But there are lots of resources. People are just stepping up. The people who have lots of money are giving. Restaurants are offering free food, those that can't afford it. The students are definitely connected with their student leaders, and the leaders are in touch with the administrators as they try to negotiate some kind of resolution to what students would not ordinarily be getting. I think one of the greatest disappointments was the fact that there will be no graduation. As students said to me, I'm the first in my family to get a college degree. I had all hopes for parents, families, members, and sisters and brothers seeing me walk across the stage and so forth. So the student leaders are negotiating with the administration on how to salvage what can be done. Like, I know there'll be programs printed up. Of course, they'll get their diplomas, but some students say, oh my goodness, no graduation. But I've had to explain, people have had to either cancel, postpone weddings, make do with another type of wedding celebration. And then finally, for those who can meet in small groups, families, neighbors, and friends, they are coming together to share resources, to pray together, those kinds of things, small group meals, not necessarily all carry out. Some people are cooking at home and so forth. And of course, there are other online resources that professors provide in their courses. The university, if I'm not mistaken, has some online resources. And then finally, we know that states, counties, as well as the federal government has resources as to where people can get assistance. But again, as Dr. Jones mentioned and other panelists are going to say, we know that there are inequities in resources that are available statewide and even nationally, although leaders are trying to close those gaps. So thank you for having me on.
Hello, I'm Angela Emmons-Burley, and I'm going to talk about 5 different areas. I'm going to begin with how the COVID-19 virus spreads. I'm going to discuss those people that are at risk. I'm going to then go into what are the signs and symptoms that COVID-19 patients present with. I'm going to briefly touch on testing, and then I'm going to go into how we can protect ourselves. In general, the COVID-19 virus is a respiratory virus, and it's spread through droplet nuclei, which means a person either sneezes, coughs, or even when they're talking and in close proximity to others, the virus is then transmitted airborne and then inhaled by the recipient. And it can also be passively transferred from your hands to your face and other orifice, to include eyes, nose, and mouth. Now, those people that are at risk, there are multiple risk factors. We talk about age, and initially when COVID-19 occurred, we were mostly concerned about middle-aged people and people over 50. We now know that it's an equal opportunity killer. There are people in their 20s that are suffering from this viral illness, and as well as people at the other end of the spectrum. So age is a determinant for who gets COVID. Other factors that seem to put people at increased risk are being overweight, having a BMI over 40, people with diabetes, people with asthma, COPD, which is a disease that encompasses bronchitis and emphysema, as well as individuals that have diseases like lupus and sarcoidosis. Cancer patients, of course, are equally at risk, along with patients that are suffering from diseases such as HIV and hepatitis. In terms of how the virus attaches to our body, there was a report that came out of Mount Sinai in New York discussing breaking down the cell types in the lungs. And the type 2 cell in the lungs is a cell type that is very sensitive to the COVID-19 virus. And the virus binds to the lung through a receptor known as the ACE receptor. Now, ACE medications and ARB medications are medicines that are routinely used in diabetics. There are also medications that are routinely used in people with hypertension. And we found that also patients that are taking non-steroidals, all of these medications tend to bind to this ACE receptor where the COVID virus attaches and causes the virus to upregulate. And those people tend to have a more severe outcome. Now we're going to address some of the COVID signs and symptoms. We can start with something as simple as pink eye. If someone were to cough or sneeze, the viral particles, the mucus, can implant itself in mucous membranes, and the eye is one of those mucous membranes and can present as simple pink eye. Nasal symptoms are common with COVID-19, and they include runny nose or rhinorrhea and sneezing. Sometimes these symptoms are mistaken for simple allergy. Cough is usually a symptom associated with this viral illness. And sometimes cough is a dry cough, but other times people report that there's a scant, clear phlegm associated with the cough. Scratchy throat is another symptom. Some people describe it as a sore throat. Some people describe it as a tickle in the throat. Shortness of breath is one of the predominant symptoms described when we talk about COVID-19. Some people describe it as an inability to take a deep breath. Some people state that when they take a deep breath, they get a sharp pain in their chest. This is what we refer to as pleurisy. Some people have a chest pressure and heaviness that is hard to distinguish from an acute heart attack. They found that the COVID virus also attacks the myocardium and can cause a myocarditis or inflammation in the heart muscle wall. And then there's fever. Fever can range anywhere from a low-grade fever of 99 degrees to at least 102, maybe a little higher. And many people describe the fever as becoming worse at night. Next, we can talk about the body aches that people mention. And they describe them as if their body was run over by a Mack truck. These symptoms are horrific and produce what we call myalgias or muscle aches. And then there's an overwhelming fatigue that is also described. Now, many of us that work in the ER, we're seeing patients that prior to the onset of these symptoms of upper respiratory tract, were coming in with vague symptoms of abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea, which was fleeting. After these symptoms, we then started seeing the onset of the runny nose, the sneeze, the cough, shortness of breath, and the fever. And then there are another group of patients that have now begun to report that they just have a loss of taste or smell.
At first, you might think it's a cold, and it could be, but COVID-19 could escalate. Here's what you need to know. According to the World Health Organization China Joint Mission on COVID-19, as of February 20th, 80% of laboratory-confirmed cases were mild to moderate, 14% were severe, and 6% were critical. Just to be clear, a mild case of COVID-19 is not like a mild cold. The symptoms will still be pretty severe. Anything less than needing oxygen puts you in this category. Severe cases do need supplemental oxygen, and critical ones are defined by respiratory or multi-organ failure. The symptoms, treatments, and timelines of having the disease vary, depending on which category patients fall into. So let's break down what having COVID-19 looks like day to day for each level of severity. It can take as few as 2 or as many as 14 days after being exposed to the novel coronavirus for the first symptom to develop. This is when it might feel like a cold or the common flu. Many patients develop fevers early on. The World Health Organization China Joint Mission saw that about 88% of people who had COVID-19 had a fever. Another study out of China showed that while only 44% of patients had a fever on admission to a hospital, 89% eventually developed one. but there have been some cases that led with gastrointestinal symptoms. Diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and/or abdominal discomfort may appear a couple of days before respiratory symptoms. This isn't the norm, though, because COVID-19 is a respiratory disease. That means for most patients, the virus will start and end with the lungs. In the early days of infection, the virus invades lung cells. Specifically, this can damage the cilia, the hair-like projections that move around to keep airways clear of mucus and debris. When cells get infected, they die and shed off, adding to the debris and hindering your body's ability to keep stuff out of the lungs and trachea. The inflammation causes damage, and damage causes more inflammation, and this cycle could continue until there's no healthy tissue left. And inflammation might explain why a dry cough is one of the most common symptoms. Same goes for shortness of breath and phlegm production. Other symptoms that can appear around this time are fatigue, sore throat, headache, joint or muscle pain, chills, and a runny nose. By day 5, patients with pre-existing conditions might find that they have trouble breathing, and it usually takes about 7 days for a person to go to a hospital. Mild cases, though, usually clear up by this time. But those with moderate to critical cases will have developed pneumonia, which can range from non-life-threatening to severe. Recovery time for these patients could be anywhere from a few days to weeks. For some severe and critical cases, though, symptoms can escalate into acute respiratory distress syndrome. ARDS is an illness that happens when fluid builds up in the lungs. Inflammation triggers a flood of immune cells that are meant to target the infection. They're usually isolated to infected areas, but sometimes the body goes overboard, which is when the immune cells start killing anything in their path, including healthy cells. ARDS is often fatal. In critical cases, it can lead to respiratory failure, requiring advanced life support, and this is most likely when patients head to the ICU. ARDS treatment includes supplemental oxygen and mechanical ventilation. The goal is to get more oxygen into the bloodstream, since the lungs can't. When this treatment doesn't work, the lungs are basically too flooded to get any oxygen into your bloodstream. That's the cause of most COVID-19 deaths. And even when a patient survives this phase, they could be left with permanent lung damage. SARS punched holes in some infected people's lungs, giving them a honeycomb effect. And these lesions have been seen in people affected by the novel coronavirus too. Early studies found that most people who die of the disease will do so within 14 to 19 days. And on average, people who recover are released from the hospital after 2.5 weeks. But with the most critical cases, recovery could take months. Once a patient is in the recovery period, it's possible that they could still be contagious. These people should work with their doctors and public health officials to determine when they're no longer a risk. As of now, there is no vaccine for the virus, so the best way to avoid getting sick is to avoid being exposed. COVID-19 spreads easily from person to person through coughing and sneezing, so wash your hands often and avoid close contact with people who are sick, and clean and disinfect surfaces that you use daily. COVID-19 should be taken seriously, but most cases are survivable, so stay home, stay clean, and don't panic.
Diagnostic testing for COVID-19 in this country, data is really unclear because we just have no way of knowing how much testing is actually being done. Certain countries, such as Australia and Brazil, have stated that they are doing anywhere from 10 to 20,000 tests a day. In this country, I've seen no data to corroborate just how much testing is being done. But essentially, the FDA has granted emergency use authorization for at least 20 different commercial types of diagnostic test panels and assays. The vast majority of tests that are being done are, the method is a nasal swab or an oral swab that is used to collect the sample, and then that sample is, pieces of that sample or the RNA virus are collected and then amplified and then result as either positive or negative. While we're certainly aware that there are many false positives and false negatives, this is still the best that we have. Abbott Laboratory recently, as of Wednesday, I believe, released the rapid test, which again is a nasal swab or oral swab that can give positive results within 5 minutes and negative results in 13 minutes. There are additional tests in the horizon that are tests that use a blood sample, almost like when you do a blood sugar test. And that test is used to determine whether or not there's an antibody present. If the antibody is present, then that means that the person has had the infection, cleared the infection, and can be considered to return back to work. And in conclusion, what we want to talk about is how we protect ourselves and others. Certainly, we want to socially distance ourselves from others. The recommendation is at least 6 feet. We want to practice hand washing with soap and water, particularly hot water. And we want to do this when we enter and exit facilities, when we touch doorknobs, refrigerators, anything we touch, our cell phones, our computers, all of these surfaces can be contaminated with the virus and need to be disinfected. There have been, they've looked at how long the virus lives outside the human body, and it ranges from 3 hours on porous types of clothing and fabrics to as long as 24 hours on copper to as long as 3 days on plastic. It's also can contaminate your hair. So again, we should practice hand washing. This slide just helps us to explain protocols that we should abide by when leaving our home and when we enter our home. And it essentially emphasizes some of the things that I suggested about practicing good hygiene, using antiseptics like Purell or alcohol, which at least has 65% alcohol to kill the virus. We want to, they tell us not to use money, and if we use money, clearly we need to disinfect our hands before we're transferring it or collecting it. Public transportation is discouraged. Even pets. They say that pets, we want to try to avoid pets from brushing up against surfaces and then brushing up against us. Those are some things we can do when we leave our home. And then when we return home, we need to not, or be careful about the surfaces we touch, make sure we disinfect them, remove our clothing, remove our shoes. And as you can follow along, the rest is left for you to read on your own. Thank you. I will now turn over the discussion to Attorney Lisa Hayes, who will discuss telemedicine.
Thank you, Dr. Emmons, and thank you. That's interesting because no matter how much television we've watched and how many texts we've read, I think all of us learned something by your presentation. Good evening. Most of us have had at least a passing knowledge of telehealth services, and I expect that will change over the coming weeks and months. Telehealth means, and what exactly are telehealth services? Telehealth services is the use of electronic information and communication technologies by telehealth providers to deliver healthcare services. And healthcare services includes assessment, diagnosis, consultation, mere consultation, treatment, education, all of it, the entire range, self-management, all of it. When talking about telehealth, we are generally referring to three types of service delivery. The first is telemedicine. That's a catch-all phrase, and it means the synchronous two-way electronic audio-visual communications to deliver clinical health services, which again includes assessment, diagnostic, treatment of the patient, while the patient is at an originating site and the telehealth provider is at a distant site. Now, this is the type of telehealth services that most of us are familiar with. Remote patient monitoring. That is less common, but I suspect will grow in popularity. And that, again, is a synchronous, or it could be asynchronous, electronic information and communication technology that collects the personal health information and media data from the patient and originating site, and that information is transmitted to a telehealth provider at a distant site. Again, the provider is going to use this information for the treatment and management of medical conditions, usually medical conditions that frequent monitoring. And you're going to see this more and more in the treatment of chronic conditions as chronic conditions become more widespread. And that includes conditions like congestive heart failure, diabetes, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, wound care, etc. Store and forward technology is the use of asynchronous electronic transmission. Again, all of this is electronically transmitted of a patient's health information in the form of patient-specific digital images and pre-recorded videos from a provider at an originating site to a telehealth provider at a distant site. And that is used more when there's communication between primary care doctor and a specialist. I'll use that as an example. Why is telehealth important? Another stage in the ongoing evolution of new models of delivery of care and patient-physician interactions. Clearly, this has been in existence for a while. It has become an established, valid treatment modality for disasters, epidemics, and clearly now pandemics. It provides a greater degree of parity between urban patients, for example, in and within the vicinity of large academic medical centers, and rural areas where distance severely impacts access to care. Telehealth growth is accelerated by the shift to value-based care. Many of you may be familiar with value-based care. It's a new method for reimbursing healthcare services with an emphasis on cost effectiveness. And you can, of course, see why telehealth services would be very interesting to large insurance companies. Consumer demand for mobile on-demand services. Certainly, as the population of millennials become more dependent, and we all know this, on mobile devices, they are going to expect more and more services to come through those mobile devices, and healthcare is going to be one of those. I mentioned earlier the shortage of rural providers. As the number of rural healthcare providers dwindles, you will see more of a dependence on telehealth services. In my instance, for example, health system consolidations, where many specialists are concentrated in one facility, and the outside facilities are becoming more and more dependent on ambulatory care or primary care services. According to 2018 state review, 49 states in the District of Columbia had some kind of definition of telehealth, telemedicine, or both. 48 states provide Medicaid reimbursement for live video. 21 states provide reimbursement for remote patient monitoring. As I mentioned, 90% of large employers now offer some kind of telehealth services as part of their insurance package. What are the new regulatory changes? And that's one of the things that I was asked to talk about. This federal and state disaster emergency declarations has resulted in almost an overnight change in telehealth regulatory conditions. First of all, telephone services. Prior to the emergency declarations, very few states allowed telephone services. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's not audio visual, which is part of the definition generally of telemedicine services. But now they are allowing direct telephone because not everyone has access. So that is, I think, the most significant change, that you can now bill for a physician visit that takes place totally through a telephone. Psychological services and psychiatric services. For example, New York has expanded telehealth services to include telepsychiatry services. And that's between an Office of Mental Health licensing facility or provider and a licensed site. So now we do not require psychiatrists to be on site at a mental health facility. There could be exchange through telemedicine. Lastly, informed consent. Written informed consent is no longer required. You can obtain a verbal consent from the patient, even in those instances when you have not had a prior relationship with the patient. These are major changes, I think, in the use of telehealth. I think some of these changes will survive the emergency, as there will be lots of evidence that some of these things work and what does not work. The benefits I've talked about. The challenges are few but significant. Technology. As telehealth expands and we become more reliant on these services, the technology has to catch up, excuse me. Everyone is becoming reliant on Zoom, but even Zoom has lots of, as more people partake in, of Zoom, Zoom is having to catch up with some of the privacy challenges. Unavailability of broadband or reliable internet services all over the country is being revealed now. HIPAA security rule, that's one that concerns us, requires heightened obligations to protect patient health information. You really don't know if all of your services are over the phone. You're really not sure if that provider is taking all of the necessary steps. And you certainly don't know if the app is taking those necessary steps to protect your personal and health information. And lastly, consent. Does the patient really know all of the benefits and all of the challenges of engaging in telehealth if they've never done it before? And I include myself in that regard. That concludes my presentation. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer those.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank
We're going
you.
to hold questions until the end. So we'd like to next talk about the economic landscape and have Dr. William Spriggs, Chief Economist for the AFL-CIO and Economics Professor at Howard, share with us his insight about what's happening in the economy and to talk a little bit around the stimulus package, and then he'll be followed by Gary McPherson. Thank you, Dr. Spriggs and Gary.
Thank you. And again, thank you to our MECA group for pulling this together. I want to talk about the economic situation. I want to thank Attorney Hayes because she helped to lay the groundwork for understanding the situation. What you are experiencing right now in the economy, sort of a twofold event. On one hand, we had heightened uncertainty because no one knows what this disease is going to do. We don't know when we will be able to get it under control. And you saw from the financial markets, that uncertainty crashed the markets because people had no sense of where anything was going to go, and they weren't very confident with the president's initial reactions to the disease. The second thing we have are things that we know were going to happen because of the disease. And when you look at back in January and February, and we looked at the reaction in China and the reaction in South Korea, and then into late February, early March, we saw the reaction in Italy, it was clear that at some point we would have to shut down large public gatherings, which would include restaurants, which would include public arenas. And it was at that point back in January and February, we needed to put in place the economics of what happens when you do that. Here's why that's essential. This century, the American workforce has changed dramatically. At the beginning of this century, we had 15 million manufacturing workers, and we had about 9 million workers in restaurants. Now, today, before this happened, we had lost 3 million manufacturing workers, and we had gained 3 million workers in food and drink. So when you hear orders to shut restaurants and bars, that's the same size workforce as the entire manufacturing workforce of the United States. So if in January you understood you're going to shut down an industry as big as the entire manufacturing workforce, then you would think you would already have in place, what are you going to tell to those businesses? Because 13 million people are a lot of people to suddenly walk in one day and surprise them and tell them you don't have a job anymore. So we had a snapshot of what the economy looked like just before the massive shutdowns, but you could already see the effect of some of the shutdowns in places like New York that were early to take these steps. So the job numbers that were reported on Friday were the reference week of March 8th to March 14th. And in that week, we lost 700,000 jobs from payroll. Over 470,000 of that 700,000 were people who work in restaurants and bars. That's the sizable share of them. The rest of them were in forward-looking industries in terms of public interaction. And they were also included in these orders. Childcare lost 18,000 workers. Accommodations, these are the hotels, lost close to 20,000 workers. All this before the massive shutdowns. Then we got the news in the 2 weeks after the unemployment claims, 3 million jumped the week after March 8th, and then 6 million the following week. All of that was something that was known back in January was going to be necessary, but we didn't put the proper things in place. Now, this has exposed that we had an unemployment insurance system that was not in good shape anyway. It's very hard for people who work in restaurants to get unemployment insurance anyway. If you look in 2019, of the people who are unemployed in food and drink establishments, fewer than 8% of the unemployed workers in that industry got unemployment insurance. So we were going to have a huge challenge if the way we wanted to respond to closing down restaurants was going to be using our unemployment insurance system. So I'm going to walk through some of the changes. There was a slide before that, if we can get to it. Thank you. Some changes that had to be done to the system so that we could get unemployment benefits, not only to workers in restaurants, but also to other workers who typically don't get unemployment insurance. A reason many workers in restaurants don't get unemployment insurance is because we have, in many of our states, a tip minimum wage. The tip minimum wage is part of the federal minimum wage. There are a few states that only have one minimum wage. The problem with the tip minimum wage is that your unemployment benefits are based on your earnings record. And if your earnings are from tip wages, it's not always the case that your employer sends to the state unemployment office the portion that's made up of tips. Consequently, your wage history can be so low that you don't qualify as a worker eligible for unemployment benefits. That's the case for many workers in restaurants because many of them are tip workers or they work as busboys and they're considered tip workers as well. So that's part of the explanation why you have people who could be in a restaurant every week, regular employees don't qualify. Other reason is that many of them are part-time. And if you are part-time, in many states, you aren't eligible for unemployment insurance. You have to be available for full-time work. So that was another deficiency within the system. Now, we know that other people were being affected. We were shutting down businesses that are sole proprietorships. We were shutting down businesses that had relationships that are contractual. And so we needed to make sure that we covered these gig workers. When you shut down performance spaces, actors, musicians, these are independent contractors. They're not eligible typically for unemployment insurance. There are a lot of Howard grads who went through our speech department and are consultants to local school systems as speech consultants. Schools are closed. Many of those services to students aren't taking place. Many of those people are now unemployed. Barbershops, beauty shops, these are closed. And again, most of those are independent contractors. They aren't covered by unemployment insurance normally. So the program had to be fixed. And you see here the new set of workers who would be eligible for unemployment insurance benefits that extends beyond what our very poorly designed unemployment system had been designed to take care of. Then there's the need of those who are unemployed because of the disease itself. So the bill that passed, the CARES Act, includes all these workers. Next slide, please. And this is a nice little flow chart so you can understand the differences. The other problem with our unemployment insurance system is if you intentionally close down a business, this is no fault of the business, no fault of the workers, totally unanticipated. You really need to compensate them totally for their loss of income. Unfortunately, our state unemployment insurance systems are so antiquated, you couldn't say we want 100% replacement. For them to change their replacement formulas was going to be too complex. So what the Senate agreed to was the maximum benefit in most states gets you to around 30 to 40% of the average wage of a worker. If you add $600 to that maximum benefit, then for the average worker, the average worker in the United States takes home about $1,000 a week. So if you add 600 to the maximum unemployment benefit, you could pretty much replace the lost income for the average worker. So the reason for the $600 bonus was simply there was no way to calculate 100% replacement. The easiest thing to do was say, add $600 to everybody, and we know for the average worker, this will be replacement. Fortunately, this makes it a very progressive replacement rate, because it means if you're below average in earnings, which are most of the workers in restaurants, hospitality, childcare, those forward-looking industries where people were being laid off, you will get above 100% replacement. But we know that for those same workers, they're the most precarious anyway. They don't have any liquidity, they have no savings, they have no way to handle the very complex, as many of you probably experience, ways of how do I get groceries? How do I continue to sustain my household? This is complicated if you make the kind of wages that they make. So the fact that they're getting above 100% replacement really actually is an acknowledgement, above all else, for the difficulty and the differences in what they face. So if you are already getting unemployment insurance benefits, no problem. You'll have $600 added to your benefit, and you will be held whole, at least while this market is still uncertain through the end of July. If you're eligible normally for unemployment insurance benefits, you apply, you will get the unemployment benefits. You may be eligible for the pandemic unemployment assistance if you're deemed not eligible. If you were normally eligible, you would be eligible, and so then you'll get the extra $600 added. If you're losing insurance, your wage, either because you're an independent contractor, or you're a gig worker, or you are part-time, or you can't get to work because you have to stay home with the child, then you can apply for unemployment insurance systems. We've closed every school system in the United States. Many parents cannot meet the need of having their child at home and are unemployed for that reason. You're eligible for unemployment benefits. So this is as well as one could craft, given that we didn't do what we were supposed to do back in January and February. I would just add as a note, on March 8th, when we took the survey and we understood that we lost 700,000 jobs, we found that out on Friday. But that week, the president was playing golf with the Washington Nationals baseball team. Okay, next slide. Now, I don't, oh wait, you have to go back, sorry. You have to go back to the first slide. Each state has a different unemployment insurance system, which is why it was very hard to patch together a design that could help most workers. That link that you see there, the AFL-CIO COVID-19 state resources, will take you to an interactive map so that you can click on each state, and that will give you an indication of what resources workers have. Before the CARES Act, the House of Representatives under Nancy Pelosi had passed what was called the Family First Act, and this was to introduce paid leave. Most Americans do not have paid leave, and this bill introduced paid leave. Obviously, with a number of people sick, they needed paid leave to handle the case that they were in the hospital. But this expanded the need for paid leave, and it recognized that. So if you are in an establishment with fewer than 500 employees, but more than 50, and the reason for this is because we couldn't get Mitch McConnell to agree to anything else, and it was either help out some of these people or help no one. So please do not blame Congressman Bobby Scott, who was valiant in getting this coverage. If you're in an establishment, fewer than 500 employees, more than 50, You get paid leave if your school system is shut down and you need to stay home with the child. That will be 2/3 your pay. You get full paid leave if you are ill and need to be home. You get full paid leave if you have tested positive and need to be in quarantine. You get full paid leave if you are recovering from the illness and still deemed to be infectious and they want you to remain in quarantine. You're eligible for 2/3 pay if you have to care for a relative who is at home, if you have to care for a child who is at home with the illness. You get 2/3 pay if you uh, if 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 your establishment has been deemed to be a hot spot and you're asked, please don't come to work because your establishment is a hot spot. So workers are now protected in some select small business situations where the government is paying the small business for the paid leave, and the small business is able to access that through their tax filings. So they pay the worker, and then through their tax filings, the government will reimburse them for doing the paid sick leave that the workers need to claim. Now, what has happened is this level of uncertainty, the news that an unprecedented number of people file for unemployment insurance claim has heightened the sense of uncertainty in the marketplace and has made other companies feel uncomfortable with where things are. It has made the credit markets feel very uncertain about what to do. And so the CARES Act gives $450 billion that the Treasury has placed at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is going to use that $450 billion as a guarantee, and the Federal Reserve will now act as a bank and therefore leverage that amount in the same way a bank leverages its reserve. So this is going to turn into $4.5 trillion, $4.5 trillion in stimulus under the control of the Federal Reserve. 15 billion of that is set aside to address the need of state and local governments because the credit markets for state and local governments have totally dried up. And this level of uncertainty, people want to hold US treasuries. They didn't want to hold municipal treasuries. State and local governments are losing huge amounts of revenue. And so people were running away from that market, and the municipals that were holding those, the mutual funds that were holding those municipal bonds were finding themselves with liquidity problems. The Fed stepped in to help them initially, but this new $15 billion that the Fed has is going to let the Fed be a lot more aggressive and creative and trying to make sure that they can provide liquidity to state and local governments. Because the federal government pushed off the due date for federal taxes, this is pushed off when state and local governments will get their income tax revenue. And that's going to create a cash flow problem for a lot of state and local governments. They're going to need some bridge loans to get them from April to July when they would have normally received that income tax payments from people. So this is part of what the Federal Reserve is going to try and address. You have seen in the news walkouts from workers. Target has a walkout that is going to take place tomorrow. You've seen at Staten Island workers with Amazon. You saw earlier where auto production stopped because the UAW refused to work without some sort of protection. There are a number of cases where workers are fully aware, even outside the health sector, that continuing to work, they're going to need personal protection equipment as well as they interface to make the things that continue to make our economy run. This uncertainty is going to continue until businesses across the board make the proper investments to make workers feel safe where they're working. And this is the kind of uncertainty which we tried to prevent by having the government step in really quickly to shut down businesses that had too much public interaction. So Where we go from here, it really will depend upon how well the president and his administration can get the loans out to small businesses that you'll hear about in a moment, how quickly they can actually get the implementation of the unemployment benefits that I just highlighted. Only today did the states get the guidelines from the federal government on how to implement the unemployment benefits. So the states have yet to actually do the implementation of the rules and laws I just stepped out. April 1st was the first day you could get the paid sick leave, and we still have to see what the response of businesses are to those regulations. They have been out, they're posted. You can go to the Department of Labor website if you're a small business, and you can see the frequently asked questions that you need to know as a small business person in order to implement the paid leave for workers who become sick. If we don't manage this well, with this heightened level of uncertainty, and with the length of time it may take people to feel comfortable traveling, staying in hotels, going to public events, going to restaurants, this may linger for a long time. By making the mistake of separating workers from their employers without having planned in advance, we're going to prolong how long it takes to get those workers reconnected to the workplace. Unfortunately, in the United States, long-term unemployment is a huge issue. It would not be uncommon, given where we were, for it to take 26 weeks or longer for many of the workers who just got laid off to be reconnected, even if tomorrow you could restart all of the businesses. So the lingering effect of disruption in the labor market of this size is easily going to last until July or August, and perhaps longer. So we still have to sort of buckle up for the uncertainty and, to be honest, the incompetence of how this was managed. You are not looking at 15 million people applying for unemployment insurance as a shock to the system. The 15 million people who are applying for unemployment insurance, that is a failure to plan. Back in January, the plan should have been placed so that when a mayor walked up to a restaurant and said, "You are closed, here's your check, hibernate your business, stay in place, keep your employees in place, and when we're ready, you can turn the lights on." That's what should have happened. That's what planning should have taken place. That did not take place. This is not bad luck. This is not a shock to the system. This is poor planning, and it will infect the rest of the economy. I'm going to hand it over to Gary, who's going to explain to you how to think about this from your own personal finance, but many of our alums run businesses. It's very important for you to understand the implications for your business.
Thank you, Dr. Spriggs. I look forward to going over the financial landscape as we see it now. Next slide, please. So we're going to go over the investment markets, and we're going to touch on that and then kind of go over some concepts we need to think about. Then we're going to discuss some stimulus for employers that affect our employees, as a business owner myself, and then stimulus that is relevant to individuals. Then we're going to go into some of the markets of debt, being mortgages specifically and student loans, and what the stimulus package, how it includes that. And then lastly, we're going to go into the retirement plans and IRAs, which I work on heavily, which has dramatically changed with this stimulus package. Next slide. So we're starting with the impacts on the market, and Dr. Spriggs talked to us a lot about the economy and what's going on. I'm going to specifically focus on the markets. So when we talk about the market, and what we're talking about typically is the S&P 500. The S&P 500 saw a dramatic change. The Dow is a smaller version of it, and with the Dow, it just posted the worst quarter in 124 years of the Dow. It was down 23.2%. The S&P 500 was down 20% for the first quarter as well. The S&P 500 has only experienced losses like in the first 3 months 7 other times in a 63-year period. So while this has happened before, it's a little bit different, similar to when we were talking about things of like 2008. Now, 2008 was an actual recession. We are not there yet, nor do we know if we're there. Typically with those type of events, we're not going to know until after it happens. To be considered a recession, we need the markets to be down for more than 6 months. So right now we're not there. What we're seeing right now is a market downturn with the expectation that hopefully we can get back under control. And this failure of planning is what the uncertainty has caused, where the markets are having this major downturn as well as the businesses closing themselves. And what we're looking for is a plan to be created such that we can get things under control, get these businesses back up and running, and get everybody back to their normal lives. It's going to happen slowly, but the sooner we can do that, the sooner the markets can recover. The longer the markets are down, the longer it's going to take to recover. If we think of something like a recession of 2008, it took about 1.5 to 2 years where the markets were down. It took over 3 years for that recovery to actually happen. So during these time periods, what we have to stress, and which I'm sure you've heard time and time again, is to stay the course or stay invested. The point behind why you would stay invested and why you're looking for that type of strategy is that there's certain times or moments in the markets where we have certain rebounds of certain sectors or asset classes. So we saw March 24th, 25th, 26th, and even today, a glimpse of a small rebound. With any recovery for the markets, there's going to be those times when you experience those rebounds. If you make a change to your portfolio, or if you do make a withdrawal from your portfolio, you're not going to be part of the rebound. If you're not part of the rebound, you cannot fully recover from where you were from when the markets did go down. What we've seen is a market downturn similar to what we experienced the 2 quarters following the market downturn. So when the recovery, we see double digits returns. So again, you want to be part of that. So as much as you can, you want to stay invested, as well as much as you can, you want to make sure you're not making withdrawals to your account because they're detrimental to your account. So you need to be careful for what you're going to withdraw and or making a change to your portfolio. And I understand it's very traumatic to many people. And a lot of times your retirement accounts are your biggest accounts or IRA accounts. So even with those, we definitely have to be careful for this. It takes several years to recover if you make that change and lock in that loss by making that change. Next slide. So here in response to the coronavirus, the U.S. government created the CARE Act and then also the Family First Act, which the Family First Act, Dr. Spriggs talked about extensively. The CARE Act is what I'm going to more focus on. So with the CARE Act, for small businesses less than 500, they can use the Paycheck Protection Program. And what they need to do is they need to apply for a loan to cover their payrolls as well as their paid sick leave, medical leave, and then other costs like group health insurance and benefits of that nature. So if you are a business owner and you are in that predicament where things are rough, where you're either closed or you have to minimize the amount of revenue that you're used to taking in, this is something that you need to do. That these loans are available during this emergency period up until June 30th at this time. These loans may be forgiven as long as you're able to employ your workers during this same time period. If you're not, you may have to pay back these loans. But even if you have to pay back these loans, you have a term of over 10 years to pay back these loans with a possible interest rate of about 4% or less. That you will get tax credits during this time period as well for the wages when you are able to retain these employees. And lastly, there is that delayed deadline for payroll taxes. So at this point, the payroll taxes are on hold. So again, another advantage to trying to be able to pay your employees if you are that employer. Next slide, please. So in response to the coronavirus, for individuals specifically, the stimulus package right now is the checks that most people are aware of and talking about. So I'm going to try to make sure I give you enough information so you have a good understanding of what your expectations should be. So with the checks, right now the checks are scheduled to be $1,200 for a tax-paying adult, as well as $500 for a child of a tax-paying adult. And that child needs to be under 17. So they cannot be 17 nor older. They need to be under 17 in order to qualify. The eligibility, or the way that they're trying to decide who gets a check, it's based on your tax filing. And it's your tax filing of 2019 if you've done that so far. If you have not done that, then it's your tax filing for 2018. What they're trying to decide, if somebody wasn't required to file taxes in either of those years, the government is trying to develop a system that you can go on and still qualify potentially for this check. So if you did file for those tax times, whether 2018 or 2019, and you are eligible in that sense, you need to make sure that you're eligible based on your adjusted gross income that's on your tax form. If you're a single filer, then you need an AGI of under $75,000. So $75,000 and under, you will get the checks listed above for those amounts. If you are above $75,000 and all the way up to $99,000 as a single filer, then you will not get any check. If you're above 75 but under the 99,000, then you'll get a reduced check. The check is reduced by $5 per $100 above $75,000. They do have calculators on there for you to check and see what you're eligible for, and you need some of your tax information to utilize those calculators. If you are head of household, you need an adjusted gross income of under $112,500. If you are above $112,500, then again, your check will be reduced by $5 per every 100 above that, okay? And lastly, for married filing jointly, the AGI is under 150,000 jointly and up to 199,000. So if you're married filing jointly and you are up at 199,000 or above, then you will not get a check. If you are 150 and lower, you will be getting a check. If you are above 150,000, again, it is reduced by $5 per every 100 above $150,000. Now, the big question of when are we getting these checks? Right now, these checks are scheduled for mid-April. It's taken them some time to get the systems set up to make sure who's eligible for these checks, also how they're going to distribute the checks. The checks are planned right now to be distributed similar to how you got your tax refund through a direct deposit. So if in the last 2 years you've gotten a direct deposit of a tax refund, then you are set up to get this check the same way. If you are not set up, or you weren't set up to get a check through a direct deposit, then they are mailing paper checks. Or if something has changed with your address, or something doesn't connect with the checking account, they're looking to send a check. Unfortunately, they do not have enough people to process those checks. Right now, they anticipate they're only able to process about 5 million per day. And with that expectation, they wouldn't finish processing all the checks that they anticipate until September. So again, you need to plan with that expectation that if you weren't somebody that got a direct deposit of a tax refund, you may be mailed a check and you may not get that check for several months, the way this is working out. So we have to wait and see exactly how that's going to unfold. Now, I'm not a tax preparer or tax specialist, but again, just planning in general with your tax filing for 2019, that has been extended. So there isn't an immediate need that you have to file immediately, but if you do owe taxes and you should make sure that you start making that payment now or setting something up. With the tax deadline extended to 2015. Tax deadline is extended to July 15th. The final estimated tax payment for self-employed or businesses that may be making that for 2019, that has been extended as well. And the tax extension deadline, if you needed an extension and you follow that, it has been extended to October 15th. Next slide. So in response to the coronavirus, the stimulus package also works on your different types of debt. The primary ones that we'll focus on are mortgage loans and student loans. So with a student loan, and again, there are criteria that you have to reach in order to be eligible for this. The eligibility is that these loans that are federally funded loans, you're able to have your interest accruals and your payments waived until September 15th. And again, they have to be federally funded loans. If the loans are private, this is not part of this package. The loans that are federally funded loans or eligible loans typically are the loans that are the government loans. Right now, most of them are being called direct loans. Okay. Also, if your paycheck or payments were being garnished due to a loan that you owed on, that has also been suspended during this time period until September 15th if it was a federally funded loan. If your employer was doing tuition reimbursement or loan assistance, that will not count as income during this time period, up to $5,250. So again, if you were taking classes or still are able to take classes, the tuition reimbursement or loan assistance that employers were providing, up to $5,250 of that will not be counted as income. Going on to mortgage loans. The mortgage loans have a similar criteria. They have to be federally backed loans. And you are eligible if you lost your job, that you can apply for forbearance up to 180 days. After that 180 days, you are eligible to apply again. Renters of homes that have federally backed mortgages are protected from eviction up to 120 days. And lenders are taking their own steps for relief. This is not automatic for either the student loans nor the mortgages. You need to contact whoever your company is that you have your loans through or the mortgages to make sure that this applies to that program. These other private loans and other companies are trying to work with you as well, whether a private mortgage company that is not federally backed or one that is a student loan that is not federally backed. You need to make sure you contact them immediately if your income is affected, or at worst case scenario that you do lose your job. You need to apply to them and explain to them that during this time period you're having financial difficulties and ask what can be done that you could possibly put these loans in forbearance and do that, because they're all looking to basically help you and work with you. With the mortgages specifically, the mortgages that are eligible for this are the ones that are Freddie Mac, Fannie Mac, housing and urban development loans, the FHA loans, and also VA loans and HA loans. So those are the specific loans for that. With the student loans, these are not the private loans like Sallie Mae or the ones that are Perkins loans. So please make sure with that. But as I said, with any of these loans and any of these types of debt, please check with the provider to see what you're able to do and then see if you qualify for this program as well. There's a similar thing going on with credit cards as well. If you cannot make your payment, contact your provider immediately and let them know to see what you're able to do. Because what they've done is for all of these programs as far as the loans and as well as the credit cards, if you talk to them immediately, and say that you can't not make your payment due to your income with the coronavirus, right now they have frozen the fact of putting this onto your credit report as long as you establish a direct program with that provider. So please make sure that you're doing that ahead of time. Next slide, please. Okay, so and lastly, talking about the Coronavirus CARES Act and the effect of it on retirement plans such as your 401k or 403b and the IRA accounts. Starting with the employer-sponsored plans, as if you're the employer, plan sponsors must adopt the CARES Act. This is not automatic. So just because this program is available, it does not mean that your particular plan is able to utilize this. So make sure if you're thinking that you need to take a loan or if you're thinking you need to make a withdrawal from your retirement account, that you contact your plan sponsor or your retirement advisor for that plan to ask them, have they adopted the CARES Act? If you are the actual plan sponsor or employer, you need to make that adoption. And with that adoption, it means that by 2022, you need to make an amendment to your plan document to be in compliance. So please make sure if you do adopt the CARES Act, that by 2022, you make an amendment to your plan document. With employers that are able to do safe harbor contributions, those safe harbor contributions, if you're having a change or effect to your revenue, you can put those on hold. So you can put them on hold, but in order to do that, you need to make sure you give a 30-day notice to all participants, and then by the year end of 12/31/2020, you must fully pay that safe harbor contribution. If you're having such an economic loss that you are incapable, you feel that you're going to be able to make that payment for the end of the year, you can stop your safe harbor, but again, you need to make a 30-day notice. And if you do that, that stops those safe harbor contributions from that point forward once you make that notice and apply that change. Now, you need to make sure that you talk with your third-party administrator for the plan to make that change, to make sure everything is done, that again, you are fully in compliance to make that change. Switching now more to the participants and owners of IRAs, starting with the 401k and 403b employer-sponsored retirement plans, participants may make a request of a coronavirus-related distribution. The two ways that you make that distribution are starting with loans. The loan provisions remain the same except increase the maximum to $100,000. So you can take a loan from your account up to a maximum of $100,000. Previously, it was only $50,000 that you were able to do. The repayment of that loan is delayed for up to a year. Now, that loan repayment delay has to do with these loans and also existing loans. So with any existing loans, there is a delay that is out there. But again, you need to make sure you talk to your plan sponsor to make sure that can be updated. With a hardship withdrawal. So a hardship withdrawal, typically you have to show an actual financial hardship, being something of the nature of being close to foreclosure, eviction, having some kind of medical need or education need that you have to pay for. That has all been waived under the CARES Act if you're making a distribution based on the coronavirus related distribution. With a hardship withdrawal, that too has a maximum of $100,000 that you are able to withdraw. Now, what they've done with this hardship, which is different than it's ever been, is that the immediate 10% penalty is waived for any individuals that are under 59 and a half. So typically when you're 59 and a half and you make a withdrawal from a retirement account, there is a 10% tax penalty. Under the CARES Act, that has been waived. Then when you make a withdrawal directly from a retirement account, such as a 401k or 403b, there was a mandatory 20% tax deduction. That again has been waived. But please don't think that this withdrawal is free. This withdrawal still, for any pre-tax or earnings in that account, you will still incur taxable income. Now, what they've done is they will let you spread that taxable income over the next 3 years, or you can return that money back to your account within the next 3 years. If you do return that money over the next 3 years, you will need to amend your taxes over those course of those 3 years, showing that you put that money back. So you have a 3-year delay to basically pay those taxes, but each of those next 3 years, you will have to pay something. So with that withdrawal, it is not free. It is completely 100% taxable income if it is pre-tax money. If it is Roth, the earnings will be 100% taxable, or if you are vested with any kind of employer contribution, it is 100% taxable. You are not paying that tax up front, but you have the next 3 years that you are paying that tax. You do not get any years waived that you're not paying something. You will have to pay something over the next 3 years. And as well as if you try to return it, you will need to amend your taxes to make sure that that's been set. With the IRA, you are able to, again, withdraw up to $100,000. They are, again, anyone who is under 59 and a half, the 10% tax penalty, again, is waived. And then lastly, this withdrawal, again, is 100% taxable if it is a traditional or rollover IRA. If it is a Roth IRA, any of your earnings are 100% taxable. So please be careful. Again, this is not free money. Your retirement accounts were never made that you can just withdraw them when you want to. They're really made for your savings for retirement or for the long term. With the tax that for the IRA, if you make a withdrawal, that tax again is spread over 3 years, or it can be returned within 3 years. And if you do return that money with those 3 years, you will have to basically make an amended tax return to show that you basically returned that money. Lastly, talking about required minimum distributions. Now, required minimum distributions prior to the end of last year were for individuals that turned 70 and a half and basically had pre-tax money that they needed to pay tax on. So they had to make certain percentage of withdrawals from their account, whether IRAs or retirement accounts, and they had to pay tax on that withdrawal amount. The RMDs, or required minimum distributions, for 2020 have been suspended. So anybody who would be eligible or would be required to take their RMD for 2020, that has been suspended. So there will be no RMDs for 2020. Now, if you've already taken your RMD for 2020, then that money has been taken out. You cannot put that back. It is only for people who have not taken it yet. All right, and that's what I have so far. Thank you.